At night, there was a smell of damp lime and heated iron. Strips of wet parchment were hung up in the courtyard of the town notary so that they would be easier to write on with ink in the morning. Geese rustled in the yard, and the senior clerk counted bundles of sealing wax like a shopkeeper counting beans. By morning, they had to seal a contract for which 2 clans had been sending messengers and armed servants along the clay roads for a week. The paper spoke of the union of lands and water from a common irrigation ditch, of the passage of herds and the rights to 2 mills. Between the lines lay haste. The people called it an early marriage. The office called it a simple exchange of obligations. But hidden within these lines was a question that made lawyers' eyes glaze over. Where does custom end and law begin? Hello, viewers. You are watching a channel of documentary stories about law and human decisions. Write to us from which city and country you are watching us. Such details help us understand how the past sounds in different places. Leave a comment about what you find most controversial in what you have heard. I wish you a peaceful and thoughtful listening experience. Even the most weary chroniclers cannot call this a simple time. The kingdom lives under the rule of Alfonso the Wise, and along with taxes, war, monastic disputes, and claims by the nobility, new books of law arrive. The 7 Partidas is a crown code where marriage is written about not as the fate of families, but as a contract between individuals capable of consent. There is no place for the thunder of banquets in these chapters. They list guardianship, prohibitions on coercion, permitted terms, conditions of gifts and returns. The code requires that consent be genuine, not extracted through fear, duty, or the threat of breaking vassal ties. It distinguishes between a promise for the future and a union, which is considered consummated only after legal steps have been taken, with protection from violence, with the right of guardianship, with reservations about age and sanity. In cities, all this sounds foreign to the familiar communal words, where elders are accustomed to saying, "This is how our grandfathers did it. This is how we do it." And yet, in recent months, it is precisely the Partidas that are being looked to by those who take the risk of challenging customs. The case, which will be brought to the notary's house in the morning, smells of wet raincoats and simnim fat. This is how bookbinders soften the leather. The parties are adults, the heads of 2 families, their trustees, guardians and witnesses, the city judge, the merino, and 2 clerics responsible for recording. This is not about love letters, but about land, water, and the movement of goods. From the outset, it is made clear that this is about the merger of households in peace between people who have servants, carts, and oaths behind them. But at the center is a cleverly worded clause. The union must be considered valid immediately, and any further delay is recognized as a violation of family custom. This phrase conceals pressure. If anyone tries to postpone their life together, they will be subject to fines and threats of severing vassal ties. The lawyer, acting on behalf of the guardian, opens the Partida Codex in advance to the chapter on marriage, guardianship, and consent. He acts cautiously, like a surgeon with no room for error. In these disputes, it is not the loudness of voices that is valued, but the accuracy of references. The first myth that is always brought up is simple. Everyone around them supposedly married off their children early because otherwise the unions would fall apart. The papers show the opposite. The code emphasizes that consent is a matter for persons who have reached the age of understanding, and that guardianship does not have the right to turn into violence. They also talk about the other side, not about love, but about the economy. If someone pressures a union for the sake of water and mills, it is not a marriage but a hidden deal, and it is worthless if it affects the dignity and will of the parties. The lawyer submits a petition in the language of the Chancellery to recognize the agreement as a promise for the future, not as an immediate merger, to establish guardianship and control over property, to prohibit any attempts to force cohabitation before the age prescribed by law, and to consider the union itself valid only after confirmation of consent in the proper place, with a record by a scribe and the consent of the parties without threats. These are dry words, but they are precisely what saves us from the worst, from what in villages was sometimes called respect for elders, and in city books appears as coercion. The side of the tribal nobility responds with the usual set of arguments. They say that this has been established since ancient times, that they are preserving peace, and that violation will result not only in shame, but also in the sword. A bundle wrapped in cloth is placed on the table, a copy of the communal custom, copied by the same scribe who serves the tithe collection. In these parts, they like to refer to fueros, local statutes where every turn of phrase can change destinies. But in royal jurisdiction, custom lives on as long as it does not contradict the law. And here, the Partidas work like a wedge. They say that customs that humiliate personal freedom and replace consent with threats are not worth the ink with which they are written. The judge needs not the mood of the crowd, but a letter, where guardianship, age, and consent are described not in sayings, but in norms. The pen stumbles over dryness. There is no place for honor in these lines. There is a place for legal capacity. It gets worse. The question of dowry and gifts arises. Everything that is brought into the house can become a noose around the neck. The royal code takes a different approach. Dowry is property that does not turn a person into a thing. Gifts are a burden that does not destroy the right to refuse and defend oneself. Therefore, the lawyer asks to seize the disputed gifts until a decision is made. Mules, sacks of grain, barn keys are not symbols of love, but levers of pressure. And until the dispute is settled, these levers must be taken out of circulation. This may sound petty, but behind a sack of grain lies winter. Behind a mule lies the road to the mill. Behind a key lies control over the house. In urban stories, this is how people are saved from slow, prosaic forms of violence, without bloodshed, but with exhaustion that saps strength and turns a person into a silent object. The first prepared crack in the nobility's position appears where it is least expected. On the back of the scroll with the custom, the signatures of the witnesses are missing, and the date, written in numbers, does not coincide with the church holiday to which documents in these places are timed. The clerk whispers to the judge that this is a list rewritten retroactively, and without clerics, such a list is just a piece of paper, not a custom. The lawyer carefully unfolds another volume, the city's penalty book. There, penalties for attempts to seal unions with threats and extortion were recorded more than once. This does not concern the intimate side of life. The reports describe how the community punished those who turned family transactions into violence. These lines sound emotionless, but they send a chill down the spine. They show that even in cities that like to hide behind tradition, they know the price of coercion. The second crack runs along the line of guardianship. According to the Partids, the guardian is responsible not for the beauty of the feasts, but for the safety and property of the ward until he reaches the age of independence. This means that any step that endangers the body, honor, and property of a person before the onset of established maturity will be considered abuse. The guardian, in this case, is an adult who has served on the city council and knows how taxes and barn locks work. He makes it clear through paperwork. If the threats continue, the royal court will impose a fine on the clan, and the testimony will be forwarded to the office for review as an abuse of rights. They talk about a fine without the clink of coins. It is more like a cold wind blowing through the benches where they like to count. To the nobles it looks like mockery, as if their whips have been turned into straws. But the judge sticks to the rules. There are rules according to which even the powerful lose face if they play with power in the royal jurisdiction. The third crack is in the fragile word consent. It hides the medicine of the time. In city notes, doctors describe exhaustion from early marriages, fevers after winter travel, and bleeding, which they treat with decoctions and rest. There is no need for naturalistic pictures. Statistics on poverty, which grows when a household is forced to live according to someone else's will, are enough. Canonists explain that married life cannot be started with threats. This is not piety, but violence. The code requires that consent be given not under the burden of a stick, duty, and fear, but in the quiet of a notary's office, in the presence of witnesses, and a scribe who is responsible for every letter. In this world, every letter is a small nail holding a board in place. If the nails are straight, the board stays in place. If they are crooked, the door falls, and darkness begins behind it. At night, the ink in the notary's house cools, and this cold reminds us of the other side of history. In communities where people like to talk about honor, the physical price of other people's decisions comes to light only in hospital bed lists and priests' notes about funerals. There are no loud words there, only dates, names, and notes about the reasons. The lawyer knows this better than most. He saw how, after the unions for peace, gray winters came to the city with empty courtyards and locked doors. That is why his petition is not about morality, but about procedure. To postpone cohabitation until the age established by canon and ecclesiastical law, to confirm guardianship, to record property, to prohibit fines and threats, to record the clan's responsibility for pressure. It sounds like a cold list, but such lists add up to a life saved. And at the bottom of the bound sheets is the fear of the other side. They threaten to break the vassal ties, saying through messengers that they will withdraw people from the fields and roads. This puts pressure on the city's food supply, trade, and tax collection. The judge looks not at faces, but at the risks of famine and rebellion, and therefore demands a compromise within the law. No rapprochement until the established age. A written commitment is only a promise for the future, not a consummated union. Attempts to circumvent this are punishable by a fine prescribed in the Crown Code and an entry in the city's book of violations. It sounds as if the law has turned into a wall. But at 3 a.m, if you go outside and breathe in the damp smell of parchment, it becomes clear. This wall stands between people and that part of tradition that likes to hide behind honor when it hurts. At dawn, the clerk carefully smooths out the pages on which other people's words are arranged into a human defense. Ahead lies a hearing where the term custom will be tossed around like an old sack, in the hope of finding gold in it. The lawyer prepares another argument, not the loudest, but the most accurate. The 7 Partidas dictate that local statutes should be read not by hearsay, but according to lists approved by the authorities, with seals and witnesses. And if these marks are missing from the scroll of ancestral custom, it remains a story told by the hearth, not a norm. In a world where every shop has a knife for cutting bread and cheese, this sounds boring. But on the scales of justice, boredom is a heavy stone. It outweighs the glint of sabers and the clamor of words, and it gives people the chance to live according to the law, not according to someone else's whims. By noon, the notary's courtyard was filled with the rough hum of adult voices, like in a granary when sacks are dragged across the wooden floor. People with leather folders and wooden cases for seals stretched out, and wet strips of parchment dried in the shade under the canopy. 2 senior clerks sat on the upper steps and checked that the sealing wax was smooth and bubble-free, because any void in the wax would later become a void in the law. The city mayor gave orders not to allow anyone into the hall, except witnesses and attorneys. Guards in wide hats took up positions in the aisles between the benches. There was no music, no blessings, no sweet wine on trays. It was a day of paper, not celebration. Everything that happened concerned adults who were responsible for their decisions. Clan chiefs, their guardians, representatives, clergymen for recording, and a judge who kept the crown formulas in his memory, just as a merchant keeps the prices of grain and salt in his memory. The secretary began with the routine but coldly important. He listed the books that the court was required to read before the loud words. The first was the Royal Code on marriage, consent, and guardianship. The chapters on guardianship stated that the will of the person and the safety of their body and property were above tribal threats and court customs. The second was the city's Book of Fines, which contained dry lines about penalties for coercion into unions and for attempts to cover up violence with honor. The third was a list of local statutes recognized by the Crown, with seals whose impressions could be verified on an inkboard. Only after this was a scroll with the so-called custom of the clan, kept by the nobility, placed on the table. In it, they promised to immediately consider the union consummated and to impose fines for each day of delay. The clerk unfolded it like a fisherman unfolds a net. He looked at the knots and loops, not at the shine. On the back, there was nothing that carried more weight than threats, the necessary signatures and witness marks that turned stories told by the hearth into the norm. This emptiness in the wax gave off a musty smell. The lawyer, acting on behalf of the guardian, moved according to the rules, like a man walking on stone slabs in marshy terrain, feeling for solid ground. He stated what in legalese sounds unemotional, but hits home. The agreement between the parties concerned a future economic union, not immediate cohabitation. Consent is mandatory and cannot be considered valid if it is based on threats to break vassal ties. Any gifts must be limited to the amount established by the Crown, and any excess is illegal and used to exert pressure. He reminded them that the royal code limits the bride's dowry to a share of the property, and anything more than that is no longer a favor, but a lever used to break resistance. He requested the sequestration of disputed gifts so that grain, mules, keys, and tools would not serve as a noose. This is not moralizing but direct protection. When keys and carts are taken away, the ability to move is taken away, and thus the ability to say no. The nobility's response was both cumbersome and fragile. They referred to old agreements, centuries-old peace, and ancestral reputation, which, according to them, weighed more than the city's books. They hinted at the city's dependence on their carts for bread, at the people in sheepskin coats who, at the first sign, would stop bringing wood to the furnaces, and at the guards protecting the roads. The judge, accustomed to weighing risks rather than rhetoric, broke it down into its components: threats to the economy and order, attempts to pressure the court, and the use of missing signatures as leverage. There was no shouting, just the accounting of fear. At that moment, another folder was placed on the table. The cleric presented a list of church regulations in force in city parishes. It spoke of the need to publicize intentions, to make entries in the parish register, and of the right to postpone cohabitation if the necessary conditions for safety and health were not met. This folder smelled of incense and mold, but its weight was equal to iron. The first stone turned over was in a place where no one usually digs. In a bundle of references to community customs, there was a note about witness maturity, an almost invisible line stating that only adult men who were independent of both parties could be witnesses. Those who were brought in as witnesses were known at the market. One supplied leather to their workshops, another kept their cattle on pasture. There was a record of their dependencies in the city book. The judge took note. The evidence was considered weaker than the seal on the royal arch. This detail did not shine, but it tipped the scales. The second stone was even drier. In the lists of fines for recent years, there was a pattern of penalties for slander about customs and for attempts to declare a private agreement a general rule. The lines repeated with the insistence of rain. Threats to break off trade over a dispute with a clan were recorded separately, as were the payments that covered up such threats. The city had already seen how clan stories turned arbitrariness into rightful. These records showed that the current bundle was not a sudden surge of tradition, but another attempt to strengthen private interests under the guise of antiquity. Paper, in the city, remembers more than human memory. The third stone surfaced from the kitchen of the law. The gifts submitted were found to be inconsistent with the crown limits. The donations exceeded the permissible share and thus became a tool of pressure. The code prescribes a limit on gifts precisely so that property does not become a lever. The lawyer insisted that this excess should be declared null and void, and everything in excess should be returned to a sealed warehouse until a final decision was made. For the parties involved, this sounded like humiliation. For the Chancellery, it sounded like a breath of fresh air. As long as the gift lies in the chest of the royal warehouse, it does not exert pressure on the will. When the listing of the papers was finished, another item was brought into the hall, intangible but palpable, like the cold of stone, a note from the doctor who served the city hospital and the Brotherhood. It did not describe bodies or scenes, but contained notes about frostbite, convulsions from exhaustion, fevers after winter moves, and the increased risk of death from exacerbations of old diseases in homes without care. It was dry statistics of misfortune and decline among adults whose lives were already burdened with work and responsibilities. For a judge, such lines are not a reason for moralizing, but new weights on the scales. If a decision pushes people into danger, it must be stopped until the risk is eliminated. What followed was what the Chancellery loves most and what the clan nobility hates: interim measures. The court imposed a protective order to consider the union a promise for the future under the current guardianship, to postpone cohabitation until the conditions of age and will prescribed by the crown are met, to seal the property and gifts, to prohibit any extortion or fines for delay, and to appoint an inspector to check for pressure from the clan. Violation of the order is equated with disobedience to the crown law, with a fine paid to the city treasury, and the name of the violator recorded in a book read by tax collectors and customs officials. The cold formula of protection has turned into a wall against which the first wave of threats will be extinguished. Zana tried to bypass the wall by going around it. They rolled out another scroll, an old promise of a future union, signed by adult attorneys and guardians of the family treasury. They hoped to present it as a consummated union. But here, another chapter of the code came into play. A promise for the future does not become a reality without compliance with the procedures of will and conditions, and no reference to family order gives the right to physical coercion. The city records contained several similar cases over the past years. There, the courts separated the promise from the consummation and set deadlines for re-announcement and verification of pressure. These official decisions sounded like an echo. Their meaning was to give people space, not to succumb to the will of others. The judge stacked these cases in a row, like stones on a dam. The most difficult thing was the fear of the clan's economic response. The city lived not only on paper, but also on the water in the irrigation ditch, on the millstones, and on the carts going to the market. The hall smelled not only of ink, but also of grain, leather, and road dust. Therefore, the judge added another layer to the security order. He announced that trade and the delivery of goods, which had been stopped out of revenge for the law, would be considered a violation of the peace and subject to punishment by the city guard and the crown guard. There were no loud formulas, just a clear scheme of responsibility. The city had already experienced similar pressure once before, and had entered the names of those who tried to use hunger as an argument into a list for extraordinary audits. This memory is lean, but solid bread. The guardian's lawyer, following the letter of the law, secured another important provision. He demanded that a place of control be designated, a house under guardianship, where adult witnesses from the church and the city would be responsible for controlling access by outsiders and for the safety of property. In such houses, there are no holidays or feather beds. They keep records of comings and goings, and each entry is like a notch on a log. To the clan nobility, this sounded like an insult. To the law, it was a way to take the pressure out of the darkness. As long as the keys to this house are with the scribe and the cleric, no ancestral threat will be put into action. Outside the hall, life went on as usual. Cheese was being cut in the shops, mule drivers were arguing in the port, and weavers were haggling over the price of wool. But the city already sensed that within the stone walls of the office, it was not only the fate of others that was being decided, but also the attitude towards power itself. Hence the lingering anxiety. If the paper did not hold up today, tomorrow every courtyard would draw up its own customs and use them to support any whim. That is why the judge insisted on control publicity in the parishes and on re-recording in the notarial book after a set period of time so that any rumor could be examined in the light of day. There was no beauty in this procedure, but it was a protection of the breath. Late in the evening, when only the guards and one sleepy clerk with a sandbox for drying lines remained on the steps, the lawyer entered another request in the book, a fine for the clan for pressure already manifested in threats to break vassal ties. He referred to the Crown formulas, according to which unauthorized withdrawal from the world for the sake of coercion for private gain is subject to punishment. He also demanded that the heads of the clans confirm in writing their refusal to pay fines for delay and any fees covered by the word honor. All these words were dry, but beneath them lay a simple thing: to prevent someone's will from becoming an instrument against the body and property of another. The city was accustomed to grave victories, and this victory, if it happened, would be just that, without music, with seals and heavy sighs from people who were finally given the right to live according to the letter of the law, not out of fear. By morning, people from the Crown warehouse had arrived with a security order. New circles appeared on the wax, and the guards carried sacks of grain, tools, and bundles of keys to a house with stone shutters, where a clerk and a cleric kept a book of entries and exits. On the same day, the guardian ensured that the parishes announced the union's intentions in accordance with all the rules, with an entry in the book and the right of any adult to comment on the pressure. The city was accustomed to such rituals as the noise of the market, but now publicity became a tool of restraint. Its meaning was simple: to bring the conversation out of the corridors and into the light, so that every step was visible and complied with the norms, rather than the customs of clan courtyards, where the word honor sounded louder than the law. This matter was overseen by adults who had the right to control their own destiny. But according to the code, they were considered minors until they reached full civil maturity, for which the Crown provided guardianship. It was this guardianship that protected their property and will until they reached the age at which they could make decisions without relying on their elders. This did not negate their adulthood or diminish their dignity, but it did provide them with a shield against outside influences. Within the walls of the chancellery, shields are made not of iron, but of lines, and every nail in those lines must be hammered in. The clan tried to take a detour. It submitted a petition to recognize the ancient ancestral order as a source of law above the city books, referring to the fueros and the older agreements between them and neighboring lands. They argued through papers that their custom was the cement of peace, and that delays were cracks through which water and grain would flow. But the 7 parties responded differently. Custom is acceptable as long as it does not contradict the Crown Code and church law, as long as it does not turn voluntariness into coercion and a gift into a stranglehold. The judge relied precisely on this principle and demanded proof of the legal force of the document, not its respectability. The clerk laid out the scrolls before him like a doctor, lays out his instruments. From the statutes he took, the requirement for witnesses, from the church regulations, publicity, and the right of the community to submit comments, from the city's penalty book, punishments for threats and attempts to conceal private interests under the guise of public ones. And every time the clan pointed to the sabers and carts, the judge pointed to the line. The louder the noise, the quieter they read the law. The first fork in the road on the third day came from an unexpected source: books on guardianship and curatorship. They stated in black and white that adults who had not reached full civil maturity could not take important property-related steps without a curator if those steps posed risks to their physical and economic security. This provision closely linked will and property. The curator was responsible for ensuring that no gift or threat turned the agreement into a trap. The guardian's lawyer insisted that until the will was officially confirmed without pressure, and until the end of the curatorship, any coercion to live together should be considered a violation of the protective order. The court accepted the argument and extended protection not only to property, but also to cohabitation. It prohibited overnight stays, joint moves, and any rituals that were rumored to be tests of the union. He called these conversational practices what they really were: superstitions and private rituals that had no legal force. They arose where it was advantageous for clans to replace seals with rituals, and in cities they were recognized as a collection of rumors that changed the meaning of the law. The second fork cut through the heart of the custom itself. When the seals on the scroll presented by the clan were checked, it turned out that the impressions belonged not to the community as a whole, but to a private brotherhood associated with the clan through wool supplies and grazing rights. Such an impression did not make the story the norm. The guards brought a board with black paint to the office, and the cleric responsible for verification placed the seal register next to it. There, next to the heavy wax circles, were pieces of leather with the marks of real city and church seals. The comparison killed the last argument. The custom turned out to be a private agreement without the proper publicity. In the market, this was considered a trifle, but it is precisely such trifles that determine whether a person will be protected by the law or remain a face in the crowd of clan interests. The third fork in the road concerns the realm of petty official matters, which people like to laugh about in taverns, but which judges live by. The tax collector's reports contained records of the privileges that the clan received for protecting the roads. These privileges obliged them to maintain peace and equality in relation to the city's inhabitants. Any attempt to use the roads as leverage automatically made the clan indebted to the treasury. The guardian's lawyer presented an excerpt. If you guard the road, you do not use it as a whip, otherwise you lose your privileges and receive a penalty. The court accepted this argument and warned that in the event of roadblocks or boycotts of deliveries, a fine would be imposed, and some of the rights to protection would be temporarily revoked. Between the lines, this meant one simple thing: peace is not a coin in the clan's purse. It belongs to the crown, not to the family. While the law was hammering in the nails, the clan was looking for loose ground. They tried to pull out the old promise and turn it into a fait accompli. In response, the judge picked up another heavy book about the forms of contracts. It said that a promise for the future was not the same as what was considered a consummated union. It required re-announcement, witnesses, and the absence of threats. Similar cases were found in city affairs. The courts separated the promise from the consummation, set a deadline for verifying the pressure, and only then, if the forms were clean, recognized the union. There was no romance in this, but there was discipline in the legal steps, without which the will of others easily becomes iron. The clan had to admit that their scroll was a bridge across a river without piles, beautiful on paper, but unable to bear weight. The main issue remained, the age threshold, which was debated in the marketplaces, but which was set out in the books, so that it did not turn people into prey for adult interests. In the code, the age of consent and the age of full civil maturity were different. The former was responsible for understanding the meaning of the union, the latter for the full disposal of property and body. For the younger in terms of civil maturity, the Crown introduced guardianship precisely so that any serious decisions would be made under protection. The judge tied these provisions into a single knot. Until the end of the guardianship period, there would be no cohabitation, no rituals that replaced paperwork and rumors, and no fines for delay. Consent must be confirmed without pressure, in the presence of witnesses, publicly, and with the possibility of refusal without threats. The city breathed a sigh of relief, like the sigh you breathe when a dam is repaired. It's not pretty, but the water stops pressing down. The irreconcilable part of the nobility responded in the usual way, sending people with hints and loud conversations in the markets, trying to bring fear back into the homes. But the security order now covered rumors as well. The office demanded that the bearers of threats be recorded by name and handed over to the guard for investigation. Several names were entered into the city's book of violations of the peace, and fines were imposed on them in favor of the treasury. This was not revenge. It was the conclusion of the idea that the law is more important than the market buzz. On the same day, people from the church and the city came to the house under guardianship, checked the locks, recorded who came and went, and took away the extra keys. A number of new lines appeared in the book, each like a notch on a beam, and the denser these notches became, the less room there was for someone else's will. At the end of the third day, the court issued an interim ruling, from which it was impossible to retreat without shame and fines. The union was recognized as a promise for the future, under the protection of curatorship. Until the completion of the period of full civil maturity established by the code, there would be no attempts to get closer and no tests of tradition. All gifts exceeding the limit were to be stored in the Crown warehouse. Threats to break vassal ties were to be punished with fines paid to the city treasury, and the names of the offenders recorded in a list for review of privileges. The court also demanded that the ruling be re-announced in the parishes at regular intervals, so that anyone aware of the pressure could report it officially. At the bottom, the ruling was reinforced with a formula that sounded like iron striking stone. Violation will result in a fine for the clan as a party abusing privileges for private gain. This was not the end, but it became the foundation on which new rows could be laid. The darkness of the corridor smelled of wool and ink, and in this smell one could hear the tired rhythm of a city that was accustomed to living not by shouting, but by paper. The guardian's lawyer, gathering documents into a leather folder, looked at the even lines of the letters and understood that each of them was worth hours, days, and other people's sighs. He knew that there would be new attempts to bypass security, new tricks with seals and customs, but he already had a system in place. The myth that everyone does it was sinking into the vault. Rituals were turning into empty shells, and threats of food and roads were becoming the subject of administrative fines. There was no celebration or music in this system, but there was breath in it, the very breath that adults protect so that they can control their own destiny without someone else's whip, under the watchful eye of the law, and with the opportunity to say no, not in a whisper, but in a book that everyone is required to read. By noon, the guards of the Crown Warehouse brought the first report to the office. The seals on the wax were intact. The keys to the sealed chests were in leather pouches with the scribe and the clerk, and the book of entries and exits showed a uniform alternation of lines, like on a precise measuring ruler. These lines did not adorn anyone's honor, but they gave breath to those who remained under guardianship and supervision in this matter until they reached full civil maturity. The procedure itself looked poor, counting bags, pouring heavy grain into barrels, listing tools and stove iron, recorded without poetry. But in the dryness, there was a clear thought. As long as the items are under seal, they do not oppress the will, and no delay turns into a stranglehold. The city understood the value of such trifles well. There was less whispering in the shops. The market was as noisy as ever, and the familiar shadows of people who went around persuading had disappeared from the courtyards. Where fear had once worked, now a table worked. Meanwhile, the clan rushed toward church jurisdiction, hoping that the parishes would take on part of the dispute and cover it up with the pressure of authority. But church regulations in these places have long been linked to the Crown Code, and the clergy responsible for parish records showed the same ironclad approach, publicizing intentions, the right of adult parishioners to report pressure, separate living arrangements until clear confirmation of will, and respect for protective measures for the sake of health and peace. There were many winters in the parish calendar book, and in each winter there were notes about fevers, exacerbations of chronic ailments, exhaustion after moving, and hard work. These dry notes were more convincing than any fine words. If the law and the risk to the physical stability of adults are weighed on the scales, the Church adheres to the law as an instrument of peace. Stories about tradition checks, which clan people liked to repeat in the Balagan ranks, were called here what they were: rumors that benefited the powerful. There was no place for rumors in the parish books. The royal court proceeded to examine the seals and witnesses more thoroughly than in the early days. A board with black paint, a register of city and church seals, and scrolls brought by the clan were placed on the table. Discrepancies flashed one after another. Where the city seal should have been, there was the mark of a private brotherhood dependent on the clan for wool supplies and grazing rights. Where the signatures of independent adults were expected, there were crosses of people whose names were already listed in the city book of debtors to the clan treasury. The clerk marked each such detail with a special sign in the margins, and by the end of the day, the margins were crowded. To an outsider, it looked like petty nitpicking. To the judge, it was the relief of pressure imprinted on the wall. The clearer the relief, the weaker the custom, which without seals turns into stories told around the hearth. The guardian's lawyer moved on along the lines of the code. He tied together the norms of consent, gifts, and guardianship into a single knot. In the fourth book of the code, in the title on marriage, 2 levels of maturity are clearly spelled out: understanding the meaning of the union and full civil capacity. The first level was responsible for ensuring that a person understood the contract. The second, for the right to freely dispose of oneself and one's property without elders. Until the second level was completed, guardianship was extended to a person, not as an insult, but as a shield. This combination made it possible to extend protective measures from property to everyday life. Overnight stays together, ritual snacks in closed courtyards disguised as counsel from elders, and trips under the pretext that otherwise the family would be offended were prohibited. The court declared that all such actions were a violation of security, equivalent to insubordination. Several new names of adults appeared in the book of violations of the peace, and they were punished not physically, but financially, and in terms of their reputation. For the clan, this was a slap in the face. For the city, it was the norm. To close the side passages, the office raised the official lists of privileges. They clearly stated that privileges for road protection obliged peace and prohibited the use of deliveries as a means of pressure. In previous years, there had already been a case when another clan tried to strangle the city with bread. Then the privilege was revoked, and an extraordinary collection was appointed to the treasury. This old record surfaced like a stone from muddy water. It was rewritten into the current lines. Attempts to boycott or block the gates will be considered an abuse of privilege. The next day, the gate guards detained 2 carters who, at the instigation of others, tried to return with empty carts, hiding behind malfunctions. They were given summonses to appear before the guard and return to the road without further ado. Compromises without seals and nods from understanding people no longer worked. Seeing that their papers were becoming worthless, the clan attacked the guardian's reputation. Rumors began to spread in the market that the guardian was allegedly keeping his wards in unnatural dependence. On a normal day, such words could have fueled the crowd, but now the city had a form. To record the carriers of rumors, check them against the book, summon them to the guard, and impose a fine for disturbing the peace. Several people, adults, with hands accustomed to holding sticks and measured bowstrings, were punished. In the evening, the shops were already talking about something else, that the guard had stopped sparing their own if they went against the order. For the judge, this was more important than any speech. Where the law showed the same measure for the powerful and those close to the guards, the last doubts disappeared that the security order was not an empty shell. Meanwhile, the parishes held another public announcement. The clergy read out the union's intentions and reminded adult parishioners of their right to report any pressure they might encounter. A few days later, 2 notes appeared in the public notice book. One about intrusive visits from clan servants with hints and gifts. The second about an attempt to use a pilgrimage as a cover to take wards away from their foster homes for an overnight stay elsewhere. Both notes ended up in the office, and the judge slowly added 2 additions to the security order: a ban on free visits without an entry in the control book, and a ban on pilgrimages without written approval from the curators. These strict details deprived the clan of their usual gray area, where it was not the law or ritual, but their own order that decided fates. Now every attempt to shift the defense turned into a line and a fine. Then something unpleasant for everyone came to light. In one of the old city files, a contract was discovered, in which adults who had not yet reached full civil maturity had succumbed to the rituals approved by their elders. And then by spring, the city doctor had records of serious exacerbations and treatment costs. There were no explicit scenes there, only bills, statements, notes about bed rest, and lost workdays. For the judge, this became an additional weight on the scales. Not only honor and power, but also the treasury bears the price for clan customs. The tax collector also noted this connection. The treasury pays for someone else's will, which means that the law has the right to cross that will to the point of safety. Thus, the boring word expenses became an argument against pressure. The guardian's lawyer reinforced his position with another move. He presented a list of previous decisions in which the courts separated promises for the future from completed actions, set a deadline for republication, and verified pressure not by words, but by signs. Who walked at night? Who changed locks? Who brought gifts beyond measure? Who persuaded others to participate in the ritual? In these cases, adults were given the opportunity to confirm their will without fear, and clans paid fines for attempting to buy fate with grain and roads. The judge placed these cases next to the current set like stones in a dam, and they merged into a single line. At that moment, it became clear that in the current story, the finale would not be loud words, but formulas, where even a comma is a brick. When the sun lay on the stones and it became cool at the gate, the office was filled with the smell of old wax and wet leather. The guards collected signatures acknowledging receipt of the summonses, the clerks sprinkled sand on the fresh lines, and the cleric folded the parish book into a tense binding. The judge, without looking up, made the main point. Until the end of the curatorial term, no cohabitation, neither in the homes of relatives, nor in inns under the guise of council, nor under the parish window, where they liked to arrange blessings without registration. All gifts in excess of the norm were to be deposited in the Crown warehouse. Any threat of breaking vassal ties would be punished, and the name of the adult offender would be recorded in the Book of Privileges. Any ritual checks would be considered superstitions, and the guards would be instructed to stop them as a violation of security and peace. Behind these lines lay a simple but heavy thought. The bodies and property of adults do not become currency in someone else's game as long as the law holds the line. By evening, only the guards and one clerk remained on the steps. He counted the bags of keys, touched the seal impressions with his palm, and turned off the oil lamp. The city was enveloped in the quiet night that had been sought throughout the long, damp day. No whispering under the windows, no late footsteps in the corridors, no empty customs hidden between words. The next morning, the court was to turn the interim wall into a final decision. The city did not expect beauty. It expected the paper to hold out this time too, just as a dam holds out when the water roars loudest. The morning of the final day began with a heavy silence in the office corridor. Oil lamps were cooling on the windowsills, warm wax circles lay on the stone, and an even shadow from the crossbar hung over the book of entries and exits. Adult witnesses arrived one by one. The guards checked their names against the lists. The cleric held the parish book by the elbow. The clerk held the seal register, and the merino held the fine register. Everything on the judge's table was laid out as if someone were about to repair a dam. Here were the scrolls of the 7 parties. Next to them were city cases of abuse of privileges. On top were notes on repeated publicity in the parishes, and at the bottom was a list of violations of the peace. No fanfare or celebrations, just dry order. This order reflected the main idea of the case: to obtain space for adults under guardianship, to exercise their free will without the leverage of fear and profit. The court began with the quietest and most important thing: verification. The cleric showed how the seals on the scroll of ancestral custom did not match the city and church matrices. The clerk confirmed that the signatures of the witnesses did not meet the requirements of independence. The guard reported 2 cases of intrusive visits by clan servants and an attempt to take the wards away under the guise of a pilgrimage. All this looked like gray dust until it fell on the crown vault. Then every little detail began to ring like iron. The chapters on marriage, gifts, and guardianship followed the same pattern. The consent of adults who have not reached full civil maturity is verified without pressure by announcement and recording. Gifts are limited in amount and do not become a stranglehold. Customs live only as long as they do not contradict the norms that protect freedom and security. The guardian's lawyer, without raising his voice, again tied these provisions together and asked the court to finish what it had started. To recognize the union as a promise for the future, to postpone any joint life until the end of the guardianship period, to return the excess gifts to the treasury, and to impose a fine for threatening to break vassal ties. The clan tried to weigh the peace of the roads against the city's dependence on grain. They hoped that the fear of hunger would outweigh the book. But the registers of privileges clearly state that privileges for the protection of supplies oblige equal treatment of all citizens. Abuse of this right turns the holder of the privilege into a debtor to the treasury. The court brought up old cases where similar attempts had already resulted in the removal of privileges and the imposition of fines, and placed them alongside the current dispute like stones in a single masonry. At that moment, it became clear how easily the myth of the cement of peace turns into a common lever of private interest if it is not backed up by paper. There was no applause in the city hall. There were nods from the guards, 2 new names in the book of violations of peace, and the smell of wet leather from the binding. Another layer of the final day came not from the market, but from hospital records. The Brotherhood's doctor handed over a dry list of winter exacerbations, the cost of decoctions and bed rest for adults, whom the clans had dragged into ritual checks and councils of elders in past cases. The scenes were not described there, but it was clear what the beautiful word honor turns into when it weighs on everyday life. Community expenses, lost work days, long lines under the heading weakness after moving, fever after hard work, exacerbation of old ailments. The court did not moralize, it calculated. If the treasury and the Brotherhood bear the cost of someone else's leverage, the law has the right to cut off that leverage before it turns people into expendable material. When all the heavy and light papers were in place, the judge drew a line. The decision sounded even, without rhetoric, like counting bags, to recognize the disputed union as a promise for the future, to maintain guardianship until the end of the period, established by Crown regulations for full civil maturity, to postpone any joint life until the will is confirmed without pressure or threats, in a notarial record and in the presence of witnesses. Return the surplus gifts to the treasury and leave the measured portion under seal until final confirmation. Impose a fine on the clan for threatening to break vassal ties and for attempting to use the privilege of roads as a means of pressure. Announce the decision in the parishes. Schedule a reinspection at a predetermined interval and oblige the guard to suppress ritual inspections, gift visits, and pilgrimages without written approval from the curators. Each formula was a brick, and the mortar was held together by books. Then there was a short but important stage, implementation. On the same day, the guards of the Crown warehouse rechecked the sealed chests, verified the keys, and recorded the movement of sacks, tools, and stove iron in the book. The clerk and the cleric walked around the house under their care, recorded who had access, replaced one weak lock, and took away extra copies of the keys. A warning from the guards was posted on the gate. Any attempt to breach security would be considered insubordination. A low murmur passed through the market, but it quickly dissolved into the usual noise. People counted, traded, carried bundles, and only stopped at the ink table from time to time to ask what exactly was prohibited under the guise of advice. The clerk showed them the line, and that was the end of it. Where there had been whispers before, now there was a list. The clan did not lay down its arms immediately. In the evening they tried again to sway honor through the parishes, but the clergy, bound by the charter, read out the decision and reminded the adult parishioners of their right to report pressure. 2 notes arrived the very next day, one about excessive offerings, the other about an invitation to a circle in a closed courtyard. The guard recorded the names, imposed penalties, and explained the procedure. No one else came with gifts. The empty line in the register of violations remained longer than usual. A whole day, then another day. The city slowly returned to its noise without whispering at the doors. The meaning of the ending was revealed not in words, but in the stability of things. In the shops, they argued again about the prices of wool. In the port, the drivers quarreled over a place under the canopy, and in the irrigation ditch, they measured the water level. The guardian, who had a copy of the decision on his desk, finally removed the stone from under his elbow that had been weighing down the edges of the parchment. He had done what the dry machine of law was created for. He had not allowed an outside force to turn the adults under his care into prey for custom. The judge did his part. He held the line of the 7 parties against clan custom. The scribes did theirs, turning fears into lines of text. The clerics did theirs, connecting publicity with the world. The guard did theirs, leaving their sabers in their sheaths, but the fine in the book. The ending was not spectacular, but clear. Cohabitation was postponed until the end of the guardianship period and confirmation of the will. Surplus gifts went to the treasury. The clan paid the fine and received a mark in the register of benefits. The protection of peace extended to the corridors and courtyards. A second public announcement was scheduled so that the light would not go out. The most solid thing in this ending is the collapse of the myth. The myth that everyone supposedly always gave early and without questions was shattered by the accounting of the arch and the city's memory in books. The document showed that the union was not a sudden act of kindness on the part of the family, but a chain of checks. Publicity in the parish, registration with the clerk, verification of seals, restrictions on gifts, curatorship, the right of the community to see pressure and call it pressure. It turned out that instead of a single "that's how it's done," there are many breaks and delays, invented precisely because the world is fragile, and because the physical and economic security of adults requires more than just pretty words. Paper does not heal wounds, it warns of them. For the city, this became living knowledge, not a quote. At night, the office emptied. On the judge's desk remained a scroll of the decision, covered with a cloth to protect it from the night dew. In the corner, a lampwick whispered, and outside the window, the road hummed dully. Nearby, in the Crown Warehouse, surplus gifts, transformed from leverage into accounting units, slumbered under seals. The house under guardianship stood with a replaced lock and a notebook, where empty lines were more important than filled ones. And in this silence, the outcome was clear. Everything was decided by the ordinary actions of adults who took responsibility. The guardian insisted on the rules, the clerics announced them, the scribes recorded them, the guards enforced them, and the judge tied everything together. Not celebration, but stability. Not a loud cry of victory, but the slow, heavy breath of a city that chose the norm over habit. When the geese rustle again in the notary's yard in the morning and wet strips of parchment hang under the canopy, this city will continue to argue, trade, measure water, and repair dams. But a small, resilient knowledge will already have taken root in it. Myths have weak seams when a document lies nearby. And the strong have little leverage if the 7 parties, the penalty book, and the parish bulletin are nearby. In a world with many winters and few miracles, this is the real protection, not loud, but human.